What do Titanic, The Great Gatsby, and countless other movies have in common? Well, not just Leonardo DiCaprio. They also give us an insight into how low and non-committal the world's view of sex and marriage really is. Hello and welcome to Bible Bytes. My name is Bryn. It's great to have you with us. This is a place where we chat through some well-known Bible texts and think about their implications for us today. Well, let's have a look at the seventh commandment. And you'll find that in Exodus 20, verse 14. Very simply, it says, "You shall not commit adultery." Now, adultery, I put a definition up, is sex between consenting people where either one or both of those people are married, but not to each other. It's the violation of the commitment made in marriage to be faithful to your marriage partner until death separates you. So the seventh commandment prohibits unfaithfulness in marriage. It was given by God to Israel to protect the exclusive and lifelong relationship of marriage, which is foundational to the proper functioning of any society. The first thing we should understand as we come to this commandment is that marriage is God-given. Marriage isn't just a legal contract or something society has invented to provide some level of stability to families. No, the Bible teaches it was created by God for humans to enjoy. It's the closest possible relationship that two people can have. We see it described in the first pages of the Bible. It says in Genesis 2, "A man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." Now that idea of two people becoming one flesh refers specifically to sex, which unites or binds a man and a woman together. The only appropriate context for sex then is marriage, a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. So God designed marriage for the good and the enjoyment of us, the people he created. It's a gift from him, and from that flows the fact that it's the perfect environment for stable family life. But marriage isn't just a gift for humans to enjoy each other. Marriage is also a picture. One author puts it nicely when he says, the Bible is a book about marriage. To understand that, we need to realize that marriage isn't just a union between a man and a woman. It is also a picture of the relationship between God and Israel in the Old and Jesus and his church in the New Testament. That is really the marriage that the entire Bible is about. And in fact, human marriage simply points to that greater thing. In fact, the covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai, which the Ten Commandments are a part of, is often understood as something of a marriage ceremony, marriage vows between God and Israel. It involved promises to be faithful for life, and it bound God and Israel together. We saw in the first commandment that this was to be an exclusive relationship. Israel was not to go chasing after foreign gods. The Bible describes that as adultery, actually. The Old Testament often portrays Israel as an adulterous wife and God as a patient and faithful husband. And what that's doing is it's providing an example from human experience so that the Israelites can understand the betrayal God feels when they as a nation go after foreign gods and idols. Now that we've seen just how important the marriage relationship is to God and what it points to, we can have a look at the principle behind this commandment. And that can be summed up with the statement, marriage isn't a joke. Now, adultery carried the ultimate punishment in Israel's law, the death penalty. God is serious about protecting marriage. The marriage commitment is a serious one. Adultery is described in Genesis and other places as a great sin, and it is a sin which is also described as primarily against God. So it's not a crime first and foremost against the cheated spouse. It's that too, but it's a crime against God himself. That probably raises the question in our minds, how is committing adultery against another person primarily against God? Well, it's actually quite simple. God hates unfaithfulness in whatever form it takes. It is the complete opposite of what his character is like. His character that's been revealed to us in the book of Exodus as he's made promises and he's kept them to his people. It's one of his key character traits throughout the Bible story. It's how he is described, the faithful God. And so when God entered this marriage-like relationship with Israel, he committed himself to being completely faithful to them. But God actually wasn't the only one who made commitments in this relationship. Israel committed themselves to being faithful to God, to serve him only, and to keep their promises and obey the terms of that relationship. One of those terms, and our focus for this evening, is the seventh commandment. They committed themselves to being faithful to their human spouses. And so when someone breaks that promise and they commit adultery, and they're unfaithful to their spouse, they're actually being doubly unfaithful, in that they're breaking their vows to their spouse and they're breaking their vows to their God. God's character is offended at both of those levels. When someone commits adultery, they are being as unfaithful as it is possible to be. They're being unfaithful at multiple levels. It's the exact opposite of God's character, the God they claim to love. So it's a bit like a father who takes his two sons to the beach. There's an ice cream truck, and he says to his boys, if you promise not to fight with each other, then you can get an ice cream. So they look at him and they say, Dad, we promise you. And so they go and they grab us some ice creams. As the boys are enjoying them, one of them gets a bit greedy, and he takes his brother's ice cream and he starts eating it. Now, who do you think is going to be more offended by this and more upset? Is it the brother who had his ice cream stolen? Or is it the father? It's the father, right? He empathizes with the son who had his ice cream stolen, and he feels that pain. But he also feels the pain of having a promise broken, having his son break his promise. It's not a perfect example, but I think it illustrates that idea of God being hurt on two levels. That's his experience when a spouse commits adultery. Now, as we wrap things up, let's look at some implications for us. There are a number of things we can learn from this commandment, which reveals God's desire to uphold the sanctity of marriage. Now, we mustn't make the mistake of thinking the Bible is anti-sex just because this commandment's in the negative. Quite the opposite. God designed sex to be enjoyed, but it is only to be enjoyed in marriage. And the reason for this is clear. It's that principle from Genesis 2. Sex binds a couple together to become one flesh. That's repeated in the New Testament. Now, within that, the Bible has a lot to say about the goodness and the joy of sex within the context of marriage. If you read parts of Proverbs 5 and pretty much the whole of Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs as it's sometimes called, there are things in there that will make you blush. In fact, Proverbs 5 puts forward a positive view of sex, enjoying your spouse, as an alternative or as a remedy to fight against adultery. So in light of what sex is, the uniting of two people in marriage, and for their enjoyment of it, and enjoyment of each other, having sex under any other circumstances is wrong. It's contrary to the way God designed it. To fool around outside of marriage is to abuse sex and to make light of God's plan for it. You're taking something that's intended to unite two people into one flesh for life and treating it as if it's something trivial and casual. It doesn't work. Someone always ends up getting hurt. Similarly, porn and masturbation also devalue sex. Rather than something in which a husband and a wife serve each other, it's about satisfying yourself. Using porn devalues people. It treats them as objects to be used and discarded when you're done. I speak from past experience. Porn is incredibly destructive. Now, something else that needs to be said in our sex-obsessed world is that you don't need to have sex or to be married to be fully human. Jesus is the only person to live a perfect life and to be fully complete as a person, and he never got married or had sex. Right? The idea that every person has a soulmate who completes them out there somewhere, and until they find them, they'll never truly be complete, is absolute nonsense. Right? It's not as if Jesus said, the two halves will become one flesh. He said, the two will become one flesh. You can be a complete person without ever getting married, without ever having sex, in spite of what the world, and sadly some in the church, might tell you. Another implication of this one flesh principle is that in some cases, divorce and remarriage is tantamount to adultery. It's a complicated issue that we're not going to get deep into, but suffice it to say that Christians are not to enter into marriage lightly. We're not free to try again for an ever-expanding list of reasons that people might give. That's the way the world treats it, and it's not the way Christians are to treat marriage. Sexual sin is serious. Jesus didn't come and make the expectations and the requirements any easier. He made it clear that even to desire someone who is not your spouse is to commit adultery. Like all sin, adultery comes from the heart. When we realize that, and I think this is something that we all know to be true, we realize that each one of us is a sexual failure. We've all at some point or another entertained fantasies that we had no right to, fantasies that were sinful. We all have regrets. We have all made ourselves impure. And our only hope is to turn to Jesus in prayer and to beg for mercy and to be washed clean. To have our hearts and our minds purified so we no longer have a distorted view of sex and marriage, but we see the beauty and the goodness in God's design for it. If we did have that proper appreciation of God's view of sex, we would be repelled by the deviations and the distortions out there that make promises that they can never keep. So how can we go about pursuing a right understanding of sex and marriage? Well, one simple thing is to run from the things that distort our view of this. That might mean completely changing the media that you consume. Jesus called us to be radical in our fight against temptation. He used vivid imagery of it being better to gouge out your eye than to, if it causes you to sin, than to continue living with it. So it's really not a big thing in the greater scheme of things to have to avoid your favorite show if it causes you temptation. That's a small price to pay. We need to be radical in fleeing from sin. But it doesn't help to just run away. We actually need to run towards something. We need to have something that we embrace instead. And that's where we're called to saturate our minds with what is good. And I don't just mean about human sex and marriage, but ultimately to saturate our minds with the goodness of God, which sex and marriage merely point to. Finally, in all these things, we're called to trust the God who has the power to transform people. Jesus' self-sacrifice is able to cleanse your conscience, and more as you realize that it is a gift of grace that cleans us, not our human effort. And so as we close, I want to read these words from Jude, and they'll be our prayer. Now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to the only God our Saviour be glory, majesty, power and authority through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore. Amen.